This is a recording of the Institute for Research on Poverty's June 2018 webinar on structural and cultural barriers to employment for the working class. The webinar features Victor Tan Chen of Virginia Commonwealth University and Brian Halpin of the University of California, Davis. To learn about upcoming IRP webinars, visit irp.wisc.edu and go to the Webinars page under the Resources tab. Professor Chen is the first presenter.
So let me give you a brief outline of our presentation today. First, I'm going to be talking about trends in unemployment and labor market participation, and we're going to be focusing on the working class. And there are many definitions of the working class. We're going to focus on individuals who have a high school degree or less education, and they tend to be lower income. And I should note that this is not some small segment of the U.S. population. 2/3 of Americans 25 and older do not have a bachelor's degree. So even now in our modern economy, it's still a large segment who is working class, and academics who tend to be overeducated. Sometimes we forget about that. So in terms of the explanations for what we see in these trends, namely a shift towards more people not working, we're going to describe first some of the cultural reasons, the cultural explanations that may be in play here, namely the decline of the work ethic more broadly in this country, the expansion of government benefits, and how that may allow people to get by without working, and then on the flip side, we're going to look at some of the structural explanations, which center on the fact that there are fewer good jobs for the working class, for less educated Americans. And that's because of broad shifts like globalization of free trade and automation. It's because of factors that Brian will talk about in terms of the decline of labor unions, the growth of work that is short-term and temporary and unpredictable, and greater problems with job insecurity. Brian is also going to wrap things up with a discussion of possible policy solutions to get at this problem of the decline of good jobs. And I'm going to have a few comments at the very end talking about culture and structure and the ways that they are related and intertwined. So what are the trends in unemployment and labor market participation? Well, first of all, it's important to note that unemployment has gone down considerably in recent years, from a high of about 10% in 2010, right after the Great Recession, to a low as of last month of 3.8%. It's an 18-year low that we're experiencing right now, as you can see from this chart. So by this measure of things, things are going great within our economy. Now, social scientists are concerned, though, that the measure of unemployment is too narrow in terms of getting a better picture of the health of the overall economy. And that's because it misses out on an important and growing segment of the population, namely those who are not in the labor force. So let me, first of all, give you some definitions of what I mean by not in the labor force, because that's an important distinction. Well, the labor force is the adult population who are either employed or unemployed, right? And the unemployed has a very specific definition. It's not just those who don't have a job. It's those who don't have a job and are actively looking for work. That they have looked, according to the government definition, within the last 4 weeks. So when we talk about the unemployment rate, we're talking about the share of the labor force that is unemployed, that has looked in the last 4 weeks. And the reason why this distinction is made is because there is a group of people who are not in this labor force that are voluntarily so in terms of students who are pursuing higher degrees or retirees who have already finished their work lives. But where this distinction becomes a problem is that there is a growing segment of people who are not students, who are not retirees, and who are not looking for work, and their numbers have grown, particularly among men. And so this distinction that we're making between unemployed and not in the labor force is growing in importance. And if we just look at the unemployment rate, we miss that picture. And we could get an artificially rosy picture of the economy that we see the unemployment rate go down and go down and go down, but partly that's because a lot of people have just dropped out of the labor force. They're not looking for work, perhaps because they're frustrated by the fact there aren't job opportunities for them. So what are the trends, therefore, in labor force participation? The labor force participation rate gets at this population that I've been talking about of those who are not in the labor force. And it is calculated by looking at the percentage of the overall adult population that is working or recently looking for work, that is employed or unemployed. And in this measure, we see cause for concern because after around 2000, you see a sharp drop in the number or share of people who are in the labor force. And in fact, we are at a level, 62.7%, that we have not seen since the 1970s. Now, you might be wondering, well, back in the 1950s, the labor force participation rate was much lower, right? And the reason why it's increased since the 50s is because more women entered the paid workforce. So that is a large part why we see this huge increase in the number who are participating in the labor force overall. But the picture for men has been pretty grim, and we see this in this chart right here where you look at the red line of men who are age 25 and over, and you see a consistent, steady decline in their labor force participation. For women, as I mentioned, many more of them have been entering the labor force, but there has been cause for concern in recent years. Since the recession, you could see right here a downtick in their labor force participation as well. Now, part of the overall trends that we see in labor force participation are due to the fact that more people are going to school, right? And you can see that in this blue line right here, right? A lot of people that used to be working at that age are no longer doing so because they are in college or other forms of training, right? And there's also a population, a growing population that is retired and no longer working. So they are in this not in the labor force status because they've retired. That said, even when we just look at the so-called prime age workforce, ages 25 to 54, we have a serious drop-off in terms of their labor force participation. You could see this right here, and it's very much different by education levels, by working class versus non-working class. You could see for the 2/3 of Americans, again, who do not have a bachelor's degree, all of them are seeing some declines in their labor force participation. And they shouldn't be in school anymore, at age 25, or at least most of them should be done with college. Most of them shouldn't be retired at that age before 54. And so what is going on in their lives? What is keeping them from working in the labor market as past generations used to do? Well, we're going to look today at some of the trends, and we can't be exhaustive here because there's so many, but we're going to look at two sets of trends. One, cultural trends that have to do with people's behavior, their outlooks, their perspectives, things like how much they value work. And these kinds of arguments tend to be those that those on the political right advance to explain why people have been moving out of the labor force. We're going to talk about structural reasons as well, which are favored more by those on the political left. These have to do with the arrangement of the economy, how the rules are organized, and how people operate within the economy, how the kind of informal rules or social norms that people operate by, and also importantly, people's position within these institutions. Are you a well-educated worker in this labor market? Are you the child of a two-parent or single-parent household? Those things really shape people's outcomes, people's well-being in the economy. I'll talk at the end, too, about how these things, culture and structure, interrelate. So this argument that's made that Americans have lost their work ethic, it's been advanced by people like the political science Charles Murray, who wrote a book, Coming Apart, several years ago, and he uses a variety of evidence. One piece of evidence that he uses is social survey data, and here's a question from the General Social Survey that he sites where you could see that Americans in previous generations say that they wanted a feeling of accomplishment in their work. And Murray says that, well, in more recent periods, that's not as much the case. And Americans increasingly want short hours in their jobs. They want no danger of being fired in their jobs. And he says that this is, in part evidence that Americans just don't care as much about work as past generations did. And he talks about a broader set of trends that may account for that, and a lot of it is about how disconnected the working class, and he focuses on the white working class, and those survey statistics I gave were from surveys of the white working, actually white prime age Americans, but he's saying that the working class is disconnected from communities. He talks about the decline in religion, decline in marriage, and so on. There's mixed evidence about some of these things. Religion, as you know, the drop-off in religiosity is more concentrated among well-educated Americans, for instance. But that said, it is pretty striking how socially isolated many working-class individuals are in this country. And I'm always struck by this one survey question, again in the General Social Survey. It asked Americans, if you have something that you want to discuss, an important matter to discuss, how many people could you discuss that with? And amazingly, a quarter of working class individuals have no one to talk to, no person to lean on for those sorts of conversations. And that's more than the case for well-educated Americans. So there may be something there in terms of the social isolation of the working class. And that matters because, work and being, feeling a work ethic, sort of that comes from a community, comes from being embedded in a community, in families that promote work and promote productiveness and so on. So that's the argument there that the working class is dropping out because they are isolated. Another argument that's made is that leisure technologies have gotten so much better that they're luring people away from the labor market, particularly young men, and particularly video games. And here the argument is that, the Nintendo and the PlayStation have gotten so good that the graphics are that great and the storyline so immersive that, young men, they just don't want to work as much anymore. Maybe they'll have a part-time job, but they just want to go back home and play Mario Kart. So the idea here is that they're also being pulled away from work because it's not as attractive as other alternatives. And here research by Mark Aguiar and other economists make this case for the importance of alternatives drawing people away from work. Now, if you talk to prime-age men who are not in the labor force and talk about their situation, they don't really talk much about Mario Kart. They talk about having a disability. A third of them report having a disability of some kind. 4 out of 10 of them amazingly say they take pain medication on a daily basis. Most of them prescription pain medications, and this could include opioids. This could include OxyContin and pretty strong medications. 4 out of 10 of them say pain keeps them from working full time. So social scientists are trying to make heads or tails about what's going on here. I am struck by the fact that these men say they experience low levels of what we call subjective well-being, of happiness. They say they are not satisfied with their lives. They derive little meaning from their daily activities, and that doesn't really fit with a picture that they are voluntarily leaving the workforce to play video games. There's some sort of sense that their lives could have more meaning to them. Certainly they're not as excited about their lives as my 10-year-old son and 6-year-old son would be about if I told them they could play video games all day. So there's something about that kind of existence they live that is disconcerting to them, much more so than for the employed or unemployed, or for that matter, for women who are out of the labor market. Now, there's another set of arguments related to this idea of the erosion of the work ethic that have to do with how government policies may be discouraging work. And here, there's so many different policies that it's hard to get a handle on, which ones are actually contributing to, if they are contributing to, a decline in work. Welfare benefits have actually shrank in the years that we've seen a decline in work because of welfare reform. Here I look to analysis by Catherine Abraham and Melissa Kearney, 2 economists. They did a respective review of some of this past research that assesses the relative importance of these different policies and perhaps discouraging work, and they find little support for those claims in terms of things like food stamps or the earned income tax credit. They find a bit more support for minimum wage increases, maybe making employers less likely to hire low-wage workers, also increases in disability benefits. But I should note that these 2 factors are pale in comparison in terms of their impact, Abraham and Kearney say, to other factors, globalization, automation, which I will talk about briefly in a short period of time. So, is it really, though, bad values that is driving the kind of shift away from work, or is it simply just a lack of good jobs, right? And here things are tricky to parse out because, these cultural factors that we're talking about, are they really the causes of what we're seeing, or are they ways that people are coping with their inability to find good paying work and meaningful work? So maybe video games, disability benefits, even taking prescription drugs, those are ways that people cope, as opposed to causes for that they are leaving the workforce in such large numbers. And so on the other side, there's this argument that, well, there's just fewer good jobs for the less educated. And there's various ways we can measure what a good job is. Here's one measure by John Schmidt and Janelle Jones of CEPR, who say, let's look at the number of good jobs available that pay a certain amount, $37,000, that have some kind of fringe benefits in terms of health insurance and retirement plans. And let's see what proportion of the working class have these jobs and what proportion of the middle class have these jobs. And we can see the less educated are much less likely than they used to be to have these jobs that are relatively good in terms of income and benefits. So what may be accounting for the disappearance of good jobs for the less educated? Well, I'm going to talk about the impact of globalization and automation, which I mentioned Abraham and Kearney in the review say are the most important factors. And Brian's going to talk about decline of labor unions and growing precarity in the labor market. Here I just want to note that I'm not going to have time to talk about immigration. We could talk about it in the Q&A. Abraham and Kearney find that it really is a wash in terms of its impact. It's an insignificant factor, and that's partly because workers who are immigrants are also consumers, so they add to the economy in addition, perhaps competing with less educated native-born workers. So globalization, here the center of the story is China, right? Its growth as a manufacturing power that has become really the workshop of the world has meant that lots of industries in American communities have been devastated by this import competition. And in fact, if we look at where not in a labor force kind of status is most prevalent, where large numbers of people are out of the labor force, we see that it's in the Rust Belt, it's in the Deep South, it's in these communities which have seen their factory jobs disappear because of this competition. But it's not just free trade that has affected these individuals. We also have issues with automation in the sense that we just don't need as many workers as we used to need in order to make stuff in this country. Factories have robots, they have machinery that makes individuals more productive. The workers we do have, though, tend to be much more highly skilled than they used to be. And so this has meant a loss of jobs as well for workers. And in general, because of these trends, we have moved to a labor market that's much more service sector oriented. And this has implications for gender. And I mentioned before how it's really a story of, or predominantly a story of how, prime-age men have dropped out of the labor force. Well, the job losses we've seen have been in manufacturing, and we've moved to having many more jobs in the service sector where women have more of a foothold in terms of employment. So these trends have contributed to what we call job polarization. I think that word got cut off from the slide in its conversion, but really what we mean there is that the middle of the labor force has been hollowed out, that these middle income jobs that, factory jobs that had high pay and good benefits, also office jobs, lower level office jobs as administrative assistants and so on, those have been taken over by globalization, but also by automation to some extent, where these kinds of jobs, which are called routine jobs, they're repetitive, they're based on certain rules, they're clearly defined, and so on, they're easy to automate. They're easy for computers or machinery in factories to automate away. And so those jobs have been hit the hardest by these trends. Those jobs have disappeared. And what we're left with are jobs on the poles, these higher-end jobs and at the top that require cognitive skills, that require education, and these manual jobs at the bottom, service jobs that pay relatively little. And these jobs, these manual non-routine jobs, and here we're looking at this line right here, they have continued to persist as a share of the labor force, whereas we've seen these routine jobs disappear in recent years, or at least see some dramatic reductions. And then we see for cognitive jobs a great increase. And so for cognitive non-routine occupations, we're talking about things like being doctors, lawyers, computer programmers, engineers. They operate on kinds of work that are not easy to automate. By the same token, you have manual non-routine occupations. This would include restaurant servers, retail workers, and so on, where they have to interact with other individuals. They have to adapt to changing circumstances and so on. So those sorts of jobs are probably hard to replace with any sort of technology, at least in the near future, because we want customer service from actual human beings, right? That said, these jobs in general tend to pay very little. There's some exceptions here, but overall they tend to be low paid, stigmatized, the kinds of jobs that go with fast food, with McDonald's jobs, so-called MIC jobs. Those kinds of jobs are plentiful in number, but they don't qualify as good jobs for many Americans. I should note, though, that some of these jobs, too, are being automated due to cost pressures, so we might see some of these manual non-routine jobs disappear in the future, and these jobs are also being threatened at the high end as well. Automation is not just a phenomenon that will affect the working class. As artificial intelligence takes off, we might see some effects for the rest of us as well. And I like to give the example of Watson, right? That IBM computer, artificial intelligence that beat those Jeopardy champions several years back. Well, what is Watson being used for? It's being used to create treatment plans for patients. It's being used for weather forecasting. A Georgia Tech professor recently used Watson as a virtual teaching assistant for his classes, right? So these kinds of things, the robots are coming for all of us. But that said, for the most part, education still pays off. The technological change we have experienced has been what we call skill biased, in the sense that those people with skills, they still can find remunerative, well-paid work in this economy. And moving forward, we see that that's probably going to be the case. In fact, one assessment of the good jobs that have been created since 2010 says that the vast majority of them have gone to people with bachelor's degrees. So as you could see from this Bureau of Labor Statistics chart, unemployment rates are lower for those with college degrees. Earnings are much higher for those with advanced degrees. So those things still matter in our economy. And where does that put the working class? Where does that put their kids? Well, in this country, we also have these problems of income inequality that Brian's going to talk a bit about, and that means that educational opportunities have become more unequal as well, which does not bode well for the children of the working class. And I'm struck by this chart based on recent research by Raj Chetty, an economist, and others, which looks at the likelihood of whether those in the bottom of the income distribution, the poorest fifth of households, children from those households, only 4 out of 10 of them go to any sort of college, whether it's community college, for-profit college, or four-year college. 4 out of 10 of those at the very top 0.1% go to an Ivy League college or an elite college, right? So there's huge gaps in terms of educational opportunity in this country that kind of reinforce some of the trends of disadvantage we're talking about. And it's not just the problems with lacking certain types of academic skills that disadvantage the working class in this labor market. It's also that a college degree is a marker of some degree of what we call cultural capital. This is kind of a knowledge of etiquette, of culture, that allows you to be a good provider of, say, customer service in our service economy. It allows you to fare well in dealing with affluent consumers, which our economy is more geared to these days. So the working class also are disadvantaged in that regard in terms of acquiring these cultural skills that one gets either from college or from having a more affluent family background. So before I turn it over to Brian, I just want to touch briefly on race, because I haven't mentioned that, and it's a big part of the overall story. And here I want to focus on how race matters in terms of the kind of responses to globalization automation. And I want to point out that, first of all, the working class is disproportionately people of color. right? Because, they have less education, and that is rooted in historical inequalities, segregation, less access to education and work experience and so on. Those have played out in ways that have put African Americans in particular in a low economic status. But then you have modern trends that in many ways reinforce and entrench that inequality, because an education, a college education, is so much more important. These people of color start at a lower spot in this kind of this race within the labor market, and that is a barrier to their ability to succeed. And I can't talk about race without talking about the huge increase in incarceration rates, which have hit the working class broadly, but particularly working class African American men in terms of their employment prospects. We know well that having a felony record on your job application seriously reduces the chance that you can get a job. And it's just remarkable that 1 out of 3 black men ages 20 to 34 who have dropped out of high school, 1 out of 3 of them are incarcerated. And so you have this huge issue of the growth of incarceration in recent decades that have hit less educated workers, and in particular people of color, quite hard, compounding all these problems. And one last thing on race, I've talked a bit about historical discrimination. Well, this discrimination is ongoing right in this day and age. We do audit studies, researchers do, and we've done them for quite a period of time, 2 decades, and consistently we find that there's discrimination in hiring. For instance, there's studies where they take a resume with the exact same qualifications on that resume, but on one version they put an African American sounding name, on another version they put a white sounding name, and then they send those applications out and see how employers respond. And even with the same qualifications, those fake resumes with the white names get called much more often, as you can see in this chart from one of those studies. And in fact, this discrimination has persisted without any reduction for African American job applicants since 1990. So this is still an ongoing problem within the labor market. It's not just historical. All right, now we're going to move on to discussion of labor unions, and I'll hand it over to Brian.
Thank you so much, Victor. That was really wonderful. I also wanted to thank RFP for having me here today. So as Victor said, I'm going to talk briefly about the decline of labor unions in the U.S. and its impact on job quality and wealth and income inequality, and then I'll talk a little bit about kind of growing precarity, which is really related to a lot of the trends we've been talking about. So I'm just going to give a brief kind of historical overview of kind of the rise of unions in the U.S., its impact on kind of creating a system of good jobs and kind of equalizing wealth and income inequality through the 1930s and 70s, and then talk a little bit about the decline of that and how that's really impacted, again, this kind of erosion of good quality jobs for the working class. And I'll end by briefly talking about efforts to kind of revitalize the labor movement and some of the experimentation that's been happening really since the 1990s. So as we can see from this chart, if you look, coming into the 1930s, coming out of the New Deal, we had mass unionization in the United States, really brought about by the CIO and this idea of industrial unionism. Unionization peaked in the U.S. around the 1950s, around 35% private sector labor force. And really during this period of time, the 1930s through the kind of early 70s, labor unions were really thought to have this kind of dual function. Particularly in the 1930s, by raising workers' wages and their bargaining power, they dealt with, increasing workers' purchasing power. So increasing job quality was a way to deal with the slack demand in the economy. And that system really created this whole class of like middle-class jobs that we think about, kind of the traditional employment relationship where people work 30 years for one firm, have retirement benefits, vacation pay. All of those things really came about during that brief period of time and what we often talk about as the New Deal era of industrial relations. The other part that unions really brought was this idea of some form of industrial democracy, which was thought about in the 1930s as the idea of the labor question, which is, how can workers have a say over the conditions under which they work and labor? But as we see in the 1970s, since the 1970s, there's been a rapid decline in labor unions in the United States, and that decline is continuing to happen. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is, but first I'd like to sketch out this New Deal era a little bit more generally. So here we can see, again, starts around 1948, but again through the 1970s, one thing that unions really did was really tightly linked a worker's productivity to their hourly compensation, and so there was this shared broad prosperity during this period of time. And since the 1970s, productivity and compensation have been decoupled or de-linked. So we have increasing productivity through things like Victor talked about, through increasing automation and technological change, but workers' hourly compensation has really not kept up with that. And so when we look at things like wealth inequality, it really tracks this trend. And so here we have, again, the increase in unionization and a decline in wealth inequality, that is the share of wealth going to the top 1%. And as we see this rapid decline in unionization, we see, again, this increase in wealth inequality over time. The same thing tracks essentially for income, where you have, union membership, again, right here, tracking upwards, a compression in terms of income inequality, union membership on the decline, and an increase in income inequality. And for me, this is really a story about the decline in job quality, right? If we want to talk about job quality, we have to talk about jobs that pay well, that pay a living wage to the working class. And the most recent data really shows that this decline in union membership is associated with a fifth to a third of the increasing gap in income amongst workers, and that the decline in union membership really explains just as much income inequality as the increasing demand for skilled and educated workers. This trend also tracks along with union approval ratings. So if we look at the 1950s, unions were thought of very highly in the United States, and as they declined, one thing unions did is they stopped organizing new workers and began to increasingly focus on, dealing with the contracts for the existing workers that they had. So they really stopped fighting for broad level policies that affected the entire working class. And as that occurred, the approval ratings for unions rapidly declined in the United States. I will say there is research that recently just came out in the last week or two that was done by the Pew Research Center that actually shows there's been a kind of increase again in the approval ratings of unions. So it's at around 55% right now. People in the United States view labor unions favorably. And more importantly, for the first time in a long time, 51%, so the majority of Americans think that the decline of labor has been mostly bad for working people. So there has been some changes in these perceived kind of approval of labor unions. So what happened to labor? There's been a whole kind of, sociologists, economists, social scientists in general have been trying to explain the decline of labor since the 70s in all sorts of different ways, often talking about things like automation and technological change, again, globalization, the kind of fleeing of American manufacturing firms to places like China, an increasing demand for skilled workers, that kind of college premium, right? We have, with automation, we also have a kind of skills bias, right, where we're looking for more highly skilled workers to actually deal with these things. But another part of the story is something that we can't ignore, which is really a concerted employer pushback, union busting efforts. It started around the 1940s with the passage of Taft-Hartley, but really accelerated through the 1970s. And so this mass kind of de-unionization of the U.S. has really eroded what I think about as kind of distributional norms, that is norms of fairness at the level of the firm. Whether or not the CEO should pay their workers good, fair, and decent wages, or whether they should just focus on the firm's bottom line, those kinds of norms around pay equity they've really declined over time. Again, as unions have declined, the unionization threat, that is firms upholding high standards in order to prevent unionization, that has also declined. And so this is really this kind of story of a lot of good jobs have been essentially made bad over time as labor has declined. Yet, while private sector unionization has declined, which we can see right here in this dark line on this chart, public sector unionization has actually increased really through the 1960s and 70s. And as Victor mentioned, when we're talking about race and people of color, public sector union members are predominantly people of color, predominantly women, and so this has really led to a lot of social and economic mobility for those workers. So there's kind of been this trend, the decline of private sector unionization while public sector unionization has increased, but is also starting to decline now. And really what this is a story about all of these real strong structural barriers to forming labor unions in the United States. So if you want to form a labor union at a firm, we have a secret ballot election process governed by the National Labor Relations Board, where 30% of employees need to sign a petition, and then it goes to an election. That process, it can be very, very contested. In the kind of early 2000s, there was the idea of the Employee Free Choice Act, which was really looking at using card check instead of a secret ballot election. And essentially what this is if 50% plus one employees in a firm sign cards, it automatically recognizes the union and you move to bargaining. This is widely used in public sector unions, which is partly why they've grown so much. Right now, there is a very contested case at the Supreme Court, Janus versus AFSCME. The Supreme Court is set to rule on that any day now, and if they rule in favor of Janus, this will essentially turn public sector unionization in the United States, it'll essentially be a national right to work law, which many scholars really talk about how this will severely weaken organized labor, not only its ability to organize workers, but also its larger kind of political effects in terms of fighting for more progressive legislation for the working class as a whole. If you could advance the slide. So in terms of some of these structural and political barriers, there really is a very, very weak enforcement system of U.S. Labor law. And so while it's illegal for employers to retaliate against workers as they're trying to organize, the data and the research time and time again confirms that employers really have some anti-union hostility and that they engage in all sorts of unfair labor practices while workers are doing this, which makes it increasingly difficult to organize these workers. Next slide. Yet, since the 1990s, there has been a kind of revitalization effort. A lot of this has been aimed at, the biggest campaign people continually talk about was the Justice for Janitors campaign in the 1990s, really centering around LA, but spreading also across the US. And they really engaged in kind of some alternative tactics in terms of organizing. And in the last 15, 20 years, we've also seen a lot of these alternative labor organizations showing up, organized around community groups and worker centers and these kinds of coalitions, things like Fight for 15, which started with fast food workers in New York City. Here in California, in my home state, right, that culminated in California passing a $15 minimum wage bill that'll go into full effect by 2021 here. You also have things like the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, which is a union formed of independent contractors, and these kind of worker-centered community organizations like the Restaurant Opportunity Center, which works with low-wage restaurant employees to battle things like wage theft on the job. Really, I think one of the interesting things that's been happening in the last 3 months, has been the revival of strike activities, particularly with teachers in West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona, right? That's been a pretty interesting phenomenon to watch that happen, and we need to really think about if we're thinking about how labor can effectively increase job security and really create better and good jobs for the working class. So next, I'd really like to talk about this kind of growing job precarity and job insecurity, which in so many ways is really, really connected to all of the trends that we've been talking about. And, when I talk about precarious work, what I really mean here is work that is uncertain, unstable, and insecure, where workers bear the risk of finding jobs, they have very little statutory benefits, and all of the trends we've identified in this webinar really contributed to this phenomenon. And this is really about a kind of resurgence of some of the old norms of the labor market before the New Deal era, before the 1930s. And so here I'm thinking about contingent work, on-call and just-in-time employment, hours and scheduling uncertainty, and an overall decline in job tenure. And so job tenure rates have been on the decline. There are variations by race and gender. Again, for men, particularly white men, job tenure has declined most rapidly. whereas for women it's basically holding a little bit more steady. But really what this is about is kind of a creation of an entire bad job sector, as many sociologists actually put it. And so if we look since the Great Recession, most of the jobs that, and pretty much all of the jobs that have been added since the Great Recession are jobs that are non-standard. So these are jobs like independent contractors, on-call workers, temp help agency workers. And overall, the literature shows us, the research shows us that there has really been no increase in full-time employment. So the jobs that people are getting are not these good quality, secure, well-paying positions. A big part of this trend in precarious work and employment, aside from work that's being on-call or contingent or working as a contractor, a part of this has really been this kind of institutionalization, this making of regular, really precarious and flexible scheduling practices. These scheduling practices aren't really designed to be flexible for employees, but are really designed to advantage the employer in terms of expanding and contracting their workforce rather rapidly. And the literature shows us that this type of precarious and flexible scheduling, that it really leads to all sorts of earnings instability for workers. They have a hard time making ends meet at the end of the week. This leads to really difficulty in long-term budgeting because you're so unsure and your schedule is so unpredictable. It's really hard to know how much income you're going to be bringing in a given month. And that it really leads to this kind of decline of mental and emotional well-being for workers because their schedules are so unstable. It leads to all sorts of anxiety and uncertainty about the future. And these types of employment practices, not only are they detrimental for workers and their ability to make ends meet, but they also act as a structural barrier for the working class in terms of their ability to move up and out of the low-wage labor market. So if we want to think about workers moving from bad jobs into good jobs, a lot of times the argument is about having workers build their human capital, enhancing their skill set, taking classes at community colleges. But when you work in these precarious jobs where you're trying to piece together multiple different part-time jobs, or you're working a full-time job and then working part-time on the side, it becomes really difficult to enhance one's skill set, to take classes at a community college, to engage in the type of human capital building activities that might allow workers to move up and out of the low-wage jobs market. And in my own research, talking and doing interviews with low-wage workers, they're really forced to make these kinds of trade-offs between time and money, taking jobs that might provide less time, that is less regular schedules, but provide more hour or provide more money, more higher wage, or jobs that provide more time, that is they are more regular, they provide more hours per week, but the hourly wage is less. And so workers are constantly in this bind trying to balance making these trade-offs between jobs that are regular and stable versus jobs that pay more, have a higher hourly premium. Nonetheless, I do think that there has been a whole host of laws and institutions and kind of innovations over the last 10 years or so around kind of ways of increasing job quality for the working class. There have been a number of proposals at the local, regional, and state level around increasing the minimum wage. The UC Berkeley Labor Center has a really great inventory of all of these policies across the U.S., which I have a link for it right here if you're interested in looking at it. There's a lot of research on whether increasing minimum wage and what its impact is on employment levels and unemployment. But again, the UC Berkeley Labor Center has really kind of consolidated all of that research for us, which is really, really wonderful. Again, there's been these kind of broad labor coalitions showing up, things like Worker Centers, Fight for 15. In San Francisco last year, Workers Center in San Francisco was able to bargain on workers' behalf to get back $4 million in lost wages at a food service restaurant in San Francisco. So again, these worker centers are increasingly playing a role in upholding job quality. There's been a lot of legislation, again, at the state level and the regional level around fair scheduling legislation. So Oregon has a fair scheduling act on the bill. San Francisco has one. And these are aimed at really kind of making schedules more regular. So in many of these pieces of legislation, workers or employers have to give workers at least a 2-week notice before they change their schedules. And if they do change their schedules in that 2-week window, the worker is allowed a wage premium. They get paid a little bit more if the employer changes their schedule. We've seen a number of workers' bills of rights show up all around the United States. And these are particularly aimed at workers of color and more marginalized occupations like agricultural work and domestic work, workers that were historically left out of the National Labor Relations Act. So these workers' bill of rights are, again, really about kind of upholding some sense of job quality and job standards in these occupations that have been left out. And there have been these new kind of alternative ideas that are being floated out there, right? We have a handful of Democrats out there talking about these federal job guarantees, these federal job guarantee programs, and there has been some efforts at more robust workforce development policies. I'd be happy to answer questions about one-stop job centers and the roles that they could potentially play in kind of creating good jobs for the working class. So I think at this point I'm going to pass it back to Victor to wrap up.
Great. Thanks, Brian. So just quickly, I wanted to end with some concluding thoughts. We've been looking at trends in terms of employment and labor force participation and noted the low unemployment rate, but this other trend of just fewer people in the labor force. And then we were talking about, some explanations for what's been going on in the shift toward less work, this argument that's made, or these arguments that are made about the decline in the work ethic and the fact that people have other options due to government benefits as a replacement to work. But then we were talking about structural shifts that perhaps people are dropping out of the labor market because there are fewer good jobs available, and therefore they're frustrated and unable to find success in their labor job searches because of these broader shifts in the economy and the decline of a force that advocated for their rights, namely unions. Now, I want to just conclude by saying that these trends of culture and structure, they're intertwined, they're interrelated, they build upon each other, and I think that's important to recognize when we, whatever persuasion we are politically, when we look at these things, we got to understand those relationships. And I want to bring us back to that chart that I began the conversation with by Charles Murray's chart about the erosion of the work ethic. And why do Americans today want short hours and no danger being fired, as it seems they do in this survey data? Well, maybe some of the structural changes that we see are leading to these cultural preferences, right? Maybe they want short hours because the conditions under which they work have worsened, become more precarious, become more like MIC jobs as opposed to good jobs. And maybe they want a job with no danger being fired because of rampant job insecurity and fears that they don't have the options as workers anymore, that there's no more lifetime employment the way that was the case for past generations, right? So these kind of cultural attitudes may come out of these experiences within the labor market, of the structural shifts in the labor market. By the same token, to understand how people experience these changes in the economy, the cultural attitudes that they have can shape their sense of well-being. And here I'm going to end with this really fascinating chart that looks at white men, the white working class male population, and their income over the decades. And you could see this decline in recent decades, that white men today without a college degree don't make as much as their parents or grandparents did. And I should note that for other racial and ethnic groups, they have seen some progress over generations, granted from a much lower starting point. But I want to just focus on how the culture, how the attitudes, how the perspectives that people have really matter, and that this experience experience of downward mobility might be leading to some of what we see in our politics today in terms of a backlash among working class individuals to what's going on in the broader economy. Thank you very much.